Hey everybody, and welcome to the Rabbit Trail Podcast. This is episode number 127.
127 is what Brett would say, and then I would say 127.
Yeah, well, I said it right this time because I just wanted to move on. But apparently we're not going to do that ever again. So, and for those of you who are joining us for the first time, my name is Greg Harris. I am the senior pastor at the sponsoring church of this podcast called Olive Branch Community Church. And this is the podcast where we chase the truth wherever it runs. And what we mean by that is that we talk about the Bible from a sermon on Sunday, and then we take that topic and those conversations and that scripture, and we just let the rabbits out. We, my fellow
chase them around.
Yeah, we chase them around, and then we come to answers. And sometimes you guys, you'll send us some amazing questions, and we've got a few of those today. So we got some good stuff, and I've got my fellow rabbit tracer here. You want to say hi?
Hello, everybody. My name is Stephen Oldham, and I am the local outreach pastor at Olive Branch. And if you're watching us, let us know where you're watching us. Like and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. Let your friends know. I know that sounds like a weird ask, but a lot of times we know that the best way for this to create the fellowship that we have is to actually just if you like something you heard, send it to a friend and ask them to respond, and just let them know we're here. And then let us know that you're here as well. And if you have any questions, if you're watching on YouTube, and I think on Apple, at the bottom of the X section there, you'll see a thing that says, what did I got to make sure I get this right? It is Rabbit Trail Podcast at obcc.church. Rabbit Trail Podcast at obcc.church. That's a way for you to send in your questions to us.
Rabbit Trail at obcc.church.
Yeah, Rabbit Trail.
Rabbit Trail. Yeah. Straight up.
So you'll get it, it'll be in your sleep. Rabbit Trail.
The reason we're struggling with this is because
we're missing a third.
We're missing our third wheel.
Yeah, third wheel. We're a tricycle.
Yeah, we are. I like triangles. So everybody, your favorite person who brings the humor, grounds it to humanity, and brings the IQ level down. He's not here today.
Your words, not mine.
Yeah, no, just. Don't tell him I said that. Yeah, but no, actually, Brent had a family emergency, so keep him in your prayers. We love him, and we're gonna miss him, and he'll, God willing, be back soon. But we are we got to soldier forward. We just came off of our live event. If you were with us, we were glad you joined us. It was kind of fun.
I had fun.
I like the smaller venue better than I like the giant venue, but it was still cool. It was still.
I just like the people who are watching the podcast are sitting there.
And maybe it's because I was sitting behind the table and everybody's way
in front of you,
away from me, and I'm just like, I miss all of you out there.
Well, what we're trying to do, we didn't realize, is that we have interaction from the crowd. So next time we're going to try and see if we can get a mic around, because some people said some pretty cool stuff straight out of the crowd that didn't want to get up to the microphone.
Right. I was like, ooh, she does not. Straight up from France, and she's just like, boom.
Yeah.
I'm like, yeah, that was awesome.
That's not something you're going to be able to see here, but in a live event, you'll be able to get some really good feedback. So that's what I love about it.
Yeah, the live events, it's so good to connect with you guys. If you missed it, we're sorry. We missed you as well. We know there were some other things going on. A lot of you guys... Yep.
Some of the younger people were having fun.
Yeah.
Up the street.
They did good. And so we're glad you're joining us, though, because you are the ones who are chasing the rabbits today. And we are jumping in from a sermon that I preached this Sunday. I came back and off my vacations and stuff. And
were you ready to go? You have fun on the vacation?
Well, I mean, wow.
You've been here.
We
came back to the live event. That's your first one back. But you never talked about how it was when you were away. Was it good?
Yeah, it was good. We got to see my sisters. They live up north, and so got to hang out with them. But I did get to do one of my bucket list things in life, which we went to Astoria, Oregon. And we got to see the Goonies house. I was so excited.
That's quite a thing that people are doing now, going around to movie thing they really liked, and they're actually turned, I think, the Outsiders house into like a bed and breakfast type place or a museum.
Outsiders.
Yeah, the movie The Outsiders, which is the old 80s.
I just know the book.
Yeah, well, the movie had this classic house that all the greasers were staying at or whatever, and they turned they only used the exterior of the house, so they turned the interior to look like the exterior from the film, and so they're doing this with a lot of films. They did it with Goonies, I know.
Yeah, the Goonies house. It's somebody lives there, so they're like,
get off my property.
Yeah, they're like generous. They know the place, and they've got a little like donate to our
the
thing,
Goonies fund.
Like, yeah, and it's still got Data's zip line across it, but it doesn't have the whole crazy.
Dude, I would
machine. And
so
stuff.
turn that into a bed and breakfast.
Oh yeah, it'd be awesome. But actually, they have signs.
Or a B&B.
They actually have signs around town that says, "Please, hey,
don't zip line."
They stuck or no? The Goonies saved this from becoming a rich person's hole.
The Goondocks.
Yeah, they saved the
saved the
Goondocks from the rich
in
people.
real life.
Don't turn it into that so Astoria really likes to keep things, but
it's a pretty location.
But what's really cool actually is they turned the jail at the beginning of the movie into a like Oregon Film Museum. So you go in there and they've got all kinds of like different movies. They did Stand By Me in Oregon.
Yeah.
They did The Shining in Oregon.
Wow.
They did Goonies. Free Willy was done in Astoria down on the docks. So the Free Willy house is
Free
there.
Willy's in the Goondocks?
Yeah, so we went it's in the Goondocks. It's like down the street. It's so funny.
Astoria has its own combined universe.
Yeah, and then that'd be funny, like the Astoria universe. But Mouth's house. We got to see all that. And then we went down to one of the beaches. We didn't go to the actual Goonies beach, which was like 45 minutes away. But which I'm like, those kids rode a long way on their bikes.
It was the 80s. You did that.
Yeah, and then the wishing well is actually in like Northern California. So
okay.
I don't know how that worked. But
it's a bit of a bike ride.
Yeah, I didn't see that either. But we did go to the one where the Fratellis are driving down on the sand. And so there's actually a beach there. You drive your car down onto the sand.
Wow.
And so it was really cool because the ORV with the bullet holes is out front of the jailhouse.
Oh wow,
that's so fun.
It's
Lots
a nice
of fun
little
pictures.
downtown.
Really cool. I
have to look at those pictures. Let me see those.
Yeah, it was a blast. So just one of those fun things, and
we're glad you're back.
Family. Yeah, glad I'm back too.
Were
now when I watch Goonies, I have a better historical context, just like when I read the Bible and I've been to Jerusalem. Yeah, no, not the same thing. Okay, so it's just
different Goondocks to save. So yeah, you were preaching on. You came back. We started a series in Mark, and there were two before you, and this was the third one. And so we're on Mark, chapter 1, verse 40, and you go all the way to chapter 2, verse 17.
Yeah, I've had a lot of people, just as a side note, ask like, well, okay, why don't we go like verse by verse or whatever?
Yeah, they always they don't really notice that you are.
And I kind of am, but really what I was trained in is like, I want to pull the themes. I want to,
right.
There's lots of themes. Like I love asking the question, like, why is this sandwiched next to that? And so that's really kind of what, for me, inspired. Like you get your first section where you got John the Baptist and all this cool information that, maybe one day I'll get to go into on the podcast, but, and then rolling with Jesus straight out through.
Rolling with Jesus.
All the way through to this section where he's now, done this healing or done this demon, like that's so trippy. You ever think about it? Like he goes to church and that's where his first demon encounter is.
Yeah, that is kind of weird.
You're like, yeah, I went to church. Church is where the demons don't go according to the movies. No, they hang out in the synagogues. Like, what's going on here? and I picked up, that's like, one of the things I picked up in that text is just kind of a side note, which is kind of interesting. I don't know, since it's a rabbit trail.
Yeah.
We didn't even plan for this one. Was that as I did the study on that section, like what was blowing people away was Jesus' teaching with authority, right?
Yeah.
And so at the same time, what provokes the demonic is the teaching. So the word of God is what's provoking the demonic, not some like, I want to, it's like, and they assume that he's preaching and therefore they're thwarting their mission, which assumes that somehow whatever the Pharisees and some of these people were teaching, the Bible's kind of equating it as like hey, and it gets even more explicit later, like this is a demonic exercise. Like you are teaching falsely to lock people and make them sons of hell.
And legitimately turn them away from the Messiah when he shows up.
Right. And that's and
Jesus
so
still happens today, and Jesus is in our churches, and then there are people who don't recognize him. So a lot of people do say, if you were to hear God's word and his gospel, would you hear it if you're actually there, or are you preaching something that he wouldn't even claim to recognize?
Yeah, that's a fear of mine. But it was I just found it fascinating that was what was provoking, was the teaching. And then you get healing he goes from the casting out of the demon, fighting off the evil, going into removing the evil, the uncleanliness from Israel's synagogue, to then lifting up a woman, Peter's mother-in-law. You're getting, these are very prophetic visions. This is very Elijah-like, right? And then he turns around and it's all these people looking for healing and all this stuff going on. And so it's just really cool. And then we land in the passage that we were looking at, where it starts right off with, he's out in the middle of nowhere, and up comes a leper. So
now you're in verse 1 through 40. But
verse 40.
I do find, like, when we have the men's study on Thursday nights, that a lot of times the reason why people think so linearly, even with the verse-by-verse model, is it's just this section, and you don't back out and actually look at the whole sometimes. And sometimes there are patterns, even like in the Old Testament, where chapter 4 is really supposed to be compared to chapter 6. And if you put them side by side, you would see this pattern. But if you just cross it off your list and move on, or don't see it in its overall scope, then you can kind of miss out on some themes.
Well, I think that is one of the blessings and curses of verses. Like when I was in seminary, like one of those things that blows your mind immediately, because they make it a very big deal about it, is they're like, there are no verses in the original, right? There's not even, you want to
running scroll.
It is. In fact, there weren't spaces in the original.
Yeah.
There weren't capital letters. It was all lowercase, it was all uppercase running together, smashed into these long lines. And so you can read it. But I think what's fascinating to me is that a lot of people get so bent out of shape about, like, the verses. Are those verses there? Like, when we're talking about verses, there are no numbers in your Bible. There are none of these verses, these little headings and stuff. These are all added by us as reference points so we can find things. And I advise as best as you can to try to get them out of the way. They sometimes interrupt even the flow of thought in the text, and like it will this week, I think it interrupts it, because there's this attempt in scholars to go like, well, we don't know he's still at the feast, but it's like, why else? And then they're like, I wonder why they knew they weren't fasting. And I'm like, because they were at the feast on the day probably everybody else was fasting. So that kind of stuff is kind of weird to me sometimes when scholars will do that. And I know they're seeing something, or maybe they're interacting with a history but that's always fascinating to me when we dive into that kind of stuff. But in this case, yeah, we're diving into a conversation about Jesus as a healer. And
your major point was that he's the healer of a greater miracle?
Yeah, so you get him healing leprosy.
Yeah.
And then you get him healing the paralytic. But when he heals the paralytic, he says, no, your sins are forgiven, before he even heals him. So, and then he says, I'm healing so that you know I can forgive. And then he calls Levi, and these tax collectors gather, and these sinners, and Pharisees are having conniption fit. I like that term. And they're like, hey, and he says, they don't need, the well don't need a physician, but the sick. And he's like, so I don't call the righteous, I call sinners. And you're like, he's applying all of this healing with this forgiveness of sin stuff as like an overlay. It's like a mashup that kind of like, when you see me do this, I'm really doing this. And so that's why I'm calling these people. So
there's always a conversation about some kind of physical healing, and then some other act going on that's more about the spiritual ramifications, it seems like, in each of the stories, correct?
Yeah. I think that a couple of things, like maybe we'll jump to the last pericope first, since it's kind of foremost on yours and my mind with the Olympic stuff and things like that. We were asked that question.
Yeah, at the live event.
And then I preached on this section, and it's hard to make it clear that, look, when Jesus sat with the sinners and the tax collectors, he wasn't affirming them in their sin. He wasn't. That's what they thought he was doing. And he's going, no. I just called them sick. And I just called them sinners. And I'm calling them to become righteous. I'm calling them to be made well. Otherwise, why would he need to say that? Yeah. He would have said, there's nothing wrong with them. I can sit with them and hang out with them.
You're not judgy.
Yeah, he's not affirming them at all. In fact, he's telling those who are like upset that he's not like pushing them out, which is one view, which is the far end.
Get away,
right?
yeah.
And the other end would be, I affirm and I don't change you at all.
Yeah.
And he's like, look, no, you think you don't need it, but they know. Yeah. I know they need it. I've come to bring them. So I think that's important, especially since what you realize is these are called controversy
These are
stories.
Controversy stories, which is like they're all a controversy between Jesus and somebody's upset at Jesus. So every one of them has a confrontation piece, even the ones you think we don't, even the one about the leper, the way he grabs Jesus and stuff. So it's just like each one of them has a, if you're willing, or if you're able. And then later on, you have just all of these people confronting him. The Pharisees confronting him twice. One at the healing of the Levi, healing of the person through the roof. Right,
Yeah,
he comes down,
the
paralytic, and he's like having a confrontation there. So all of these are about him confronting and having this conversation about the word. And everybody's like, and it gets to Levi, and it's the same thing. They're still mad at him, and he's having a confrontation at this meal. So it's like, well, everybody at the meal, he's not accepting and affirming. Obviously, he's having a dialogue with the Pharisees.
He's having a confrontation.
And he's also challenging Levi to change his life. Come follow me doesn't mean like stay where you are. It says follow my example, my lead, my instruction. I'm asking you to change and follow the Messiah.
That's where I use that magnet concept, where the two magnets, the poles are on the same side, so they're like going to repel each other. But then if one of them will repent, one of them turns around, God's not going to change. But if we change our minds, we lock in with him. I just thought that was an interesting way of putting it.
The weirdest close experience I had to Levi's experience, or Jesus when he's talking with Levi, is when I was in the military. There was back then it was don't ask, don't tell. And there was a girl there who said she was married and she had a ring, and that at the time would trigger a response. If you didn't tell them, they didn't care. And I was her sponsor, for the squadron, and she just liked hanging out with me, and I liked talking with her. And so I brought her to church with my friends, and we had a conversation. We had a lot of interfaith conversations. I was pretty honest about my opinions and thoughts, but I was here to help her through her time in the military, right? And literally in the squadron, someone accused me of going, why are you hanging out with that person? You know what I mean? They weren't a Christian, but they were just like bashing her. And I was like, well, because I care about her and we're having a conversation. And so you're accusing me of like accepting, I guess, her lifestyle or being like with her, when I just thought of her as a friend, that we was having a conversation. She was going through some stuff, and she came to the church and wasn't afraid, knew who I was, knew what I was doing, because at the time I was leading a singles ministry. And we had conversations about Jesus, and I'm like, that's kind of cool. Like at the time, it didn't feel cool because it was heat, but it was like, you want to be accused of a person. Why are you talking to that person? I was like, well, let me tell you, because everybody is sick and everybody needs Christ to be well. And that's the reason why I'm talking to people, because I care about them.
So what do you think of Jesus? Like, here the Pharisees come up and they go, oh, the tax collectors and the sinners. Like, they're labeling these guys, you know, like probably well known in what they were doing, or you name it. But then Jesus relabels them. And they're not pretty labels, right?
No.
Like, they're the sick
sinners
and the sinners. Like, I've come to call the sick and the sinners. That should belie to us that the heartbeat, that you can hang out with people and love and be around those that you think are spiritually sick, because you're calling them.
And people go, well, that's so condescending. And I'm like, well, let me ask you a question. Like, if you don't think that the other side of that coin thinks that we're sick, and if I sit down and have a conversation with somebody who just hates Christianity, and I've had a few that are willing, even really angry conversations, you don't think they're trying to convince me that I'm sick? They'll tell me, like, you're not well, you think crazy thoughts. And I'm like, oh, why do you think I think that? You know what I mean? Or convince me. So I think it's odd when we assume that just because someone's on the other side of an issue, that they don't have the same thoughts as we do, in so much as they're trying to preach something or communicate something about what they think life is really about. And I have to listen and articulate a response. We've gone past that point to just the labeling. It's much easier for the Pharisees to label Jesus than to actually engage what he's doing, to actually pay attention to the details. They just go, well, you're one of those. And it was really hard to do that to Jesus, because he kept showing them that wasn't true with his motives and his actions and with his words, and so he
didn't fit their categories that they kept trying to peg him in.
The whole career between them and him is just them trying to put him into an evil category he doesn't fit in.
Right.
And he's like, no, that's not what I'm doing. And if you watch, and then I'm like, darn it, like they kind of get more and more frustrated at him.
And I think this is critical, because we're talking in this series, it's called Follow Who, and we're talking about, do you really know Jesus? Like, we've got our TikTok and YouTube channels and things out there. Then there are some really, like, I love Sean McDowell stuff. There are a lot of really great people out there who are talking about Jesus and who Jesus really is. Yeah, but nothing better than just to go right back to the book and look at who Jesus is and read these verses in their context. Don't just lift out, Jesus ate with tax collectors and sinners. It's like, yeah, but what was his reasoning? Yeah. What was his purpose? What's the context of that event going on in his life? And that's what I was trying to draw out in this. There was a greater miracle of the forgiveness of sins that he was offering that totally overshadows his idea of just eating with them. I mean, how else was he going to show them that you who have been socially ostracized, I receive you so that you can be forgiven of your sins? It's the same thing as if he's saying, rise and walk. You know, it's like, be cleansed of your leprosy. He's saying, I heal. I heal leprosy, I heal this, and I heal sin. And so where we get it wrong, why I harped on this at the end, was like, you can't turn Jesus just into your healing a sin machine, because he heals you,
like your vending machine.
Yeah, your vending machine of blessing, or your vending machine of sin forgiveness.
I like the tokens. I've done so many good things. I'm going to put this token in. I cared about that. I listened to the message. I went to church. Now give me what I want, Jesus.
Right. And so people do this. I think that we all can fall into this. I know I've fallen into that feeling.
Especially as a Christian, because you know there is a God and you know he can do things.
But God already is in an orientation to want to bless and care about us. So it's not about making him happy and giving us what we want. It's about us being resigned and okay with where he's leading. In this case, it's that Jesus is willing to forgive and heal the paralytic, but forgive the sins of these people, bring them in. He wants to sit with us at table fellowship. He wants us to follow him. He wants us to go to the temple and get that sin cleaned up so that we can have fellowship. I
want you to listen to him.
Right.
He gives instructions all the time about how to live your life and what to do.
So let's go back to that first one.
Yeah.
So
you're talking about 3 sections here.
Yeah.
Verse 40.
This is the first story. If you little Bible speak nerd out for some of you, they call them pericopes.
The breaks.
Yeah. So a pericope is a section of like narrative. That is a section that can be lifted in and of itself. And so these think of it like a bead that's been put next to another bead. And I think Mark puts the beads together. I think Peter was preaching these beads for a reason. And there's a couple here. One was to reveal Jesus as a prophet, as the prophetic one. He's acting like Elijah, healing and doing these things.
Elijah.
Yeah, Elijah. And then he's kicking out, he's dealing with leprosy. And that's what's here. And only a prophet could deal with leprosy. So that, I think,
doing prophet work.
Right, he's doing the prophet's work.
Yeah.
And
it would have been clear to them that that's what he was doing.
Yes. So that leads to an interesting text. So I'm going to read it, and then
you're doing it for you.
Then I want to ask you a question.
Oh, okay.
Because this leads into kind of what you were thinking about, like what you really want to kind of hit on. And so it says, as the leper came, actually both the things, but we'll start with this one. As the leper came to him, imploring him and kneeling, said to him, now we're not sure if he came close, how close he came. It's not implied in the text, but it seems like he's near Jesus, and he's not supposed to touch him. But if you will, you can make me clean. Now, moved with pity, he stretched out his hand and touched him, and he said to him, I will be clean. Now, my first question is this. What do you think? Because you grew up in the Pentecostal background. Mm-hmm. You've been around the Word Faith movement. You've seen like the prosperity gospel writ large in some cases. Would you agree?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's,
okay. So
that's
just for the podcast, everybody can hear you say yes. I see you shaking your head. But
yes.
So if Jesus didn't heal, because he can,
right, doesn't
mean he's not willing. Or what does it mean?
Yeah, I think growing up in that particular faith, the difficulty, a lot of people say...
Is he ever not willing? I guess that's a different question too. So
yeah, because to me, it's like growing up in that situation, there was a direct connection between my faith in Jesus and the lack of it if I didn't believe he would give me a healing now.
What do you mean by that? Like...
So in other words, the word says that God came and his resurrection from the dead came to save us of our sins as well as heal us. And the word healing can be interpreted in many passages as not just the spiritual healing, but the physical healing.
Yeah, many times they'll use the Isaiah passage, by our stripes we've been healed.
But later on, Peter and them are going to look at that passage very differently and relate it to the spiritual healing that is required. Some people will say it's a real strong, it's just all about spiritual healing, and those would be your more like Reformed churches and things. And others would say, well, I don't think it negates it. I don't think it guarantees it now. And so this is the debate. In a stricter, and I'm just speaking stereotypically, so I know not all Pentecostals and charismatics feel this way, and a lot of them are faithful Bible believers who are pretty calm in this area. They don't assume God has to heal everything. I did know people who preach that well. But there are groups that do preach, and have encountered them in my life, that you have to ask God and believe he can heal you, and he is guaranteed to heal you if you cling to the promise, which means that promise that you get from being healed, meaning physical illness, so that you shouldn't be sick. I've literally sat across the table for someone says, I never get sick because I have faith in God.
So faith
don't get a cold,
in God in the sense of but
believing in him.
So
believing that he says to claim it.
So help me out, because it sounds like there's in this kind of theology, there's like a faithometer, sort of like the clausometer in Elf. Like, the Christmas clausometer is too low. It's gone low, and now the reindeer won't fly. And once Christmas cheer goes up, it goes, we're up into the red, and woo, we don't need the engines anymore. And so if your faithometer doesn't hit past a certain level... So you have faith
on one end, and the other end would be doubt.
Okay.
So if you keep doubting your promises, then God can't heal you.
But if you have the faith of a mustard seed...
Yeah, so I don't know how that registers in, but really it's like that you have to believe more in what God says, hold claim to those promises, even say them over and over again as if they're almost like a mantra, and really tell yourself that's true, and don't allow doubt to enter in.
So there is a mark at which you cross a line on that faithometer.
Yeah, I don't think people give it this much thought, but that's how it plays out emotionally. It plays out emotionally if I was to go forward, and this happened to people in my family and others who would go forward for prayer for depression or physical well-being. They would say, you just don't have enough faith. You just need to be more faithful. You're starting to doubt because you're depressed. You're not getting your miracle. God can't heal you if you do that. And literally would imply that there's something wrong with the hurt person and their lack of a believing God will heal them, because the Bible says to claim to those promises and that we need to trust in God. And so therefore, if you don't see the physical well-being, then the impetus is on the person or Satan. And those are the two options.
So it's either your fault or
it's the devil. And then you need to start having people pray away particular thoughts the devil's placing into you, release sins and things like that. And it could be... The reason why I got into psychology, for those of you who know my background, is because of this. Is because this didn't seem theologically correct to me, but also did harm to people legitimately who had either mental illnesses or pains or physical well-being that was long-term. So then when you start reading the book of Job and you start reading Habakkuk and you start reading Ecclesiastes and you go, well, what about these books? And they're like, hey, those are, you get a weird kind of like, those are Old Testament, and and then you start looking, well, what about Paul and the thorn in the side? Well, that was because he was sinning, and so God did that as a punishment.
So, okay.
So that's kind of where you're, in a nutshell. So back to this passage, they would say you have to believe that God can heal so that it exercises the faith. So if I were reading this passage, I would say,
so God never. So in this case, they would argue there is no case in which Jesus would say, I am not willing.
Yeah. Not physically. And I'm not even just talking about, because most of us believe that God will ultimately heal all of us in the end, right? So then I'll ask a question like, what do you think about Johnny Erickson Tada, or somebody who's got strong faith, in my opinion, but isn't physically healed? And they really go, well, I don't know. That's up to God. It's the mystery part. And then you would get kind of a mystery pushback. I don't know. I'm not judging them.
Okay, so let's I mean, this is interesting to me because I've not grown up in that space, and it does rankle me because, like, as a pastor, I'm preaching this passage and this Sunday in one of our services. I have a woman who has had massive brain injuries from seizures and things like this in her life, and has no short-term memory, and has openly wept multiple times while while we're praying over her because she just wants it to all stop.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And to me, to think that somebody would tell her, well, you just don't have enough faith, or then the person praying doesn't have enough faith, or but then on the reciprocal side, I struggle with, it's like, well, God is telling this woman, I love you, but I don't want to heal you.
Yeah, well, I think the dirty little secret that people don't want to talk about, and I really struggle with this with a book called When God Doesn't Make Sense by James Dobson when I was a kid, because this just really rocked me because it was a big part of my life as a young kid. And I realized that, like, he talks about a friend who was playing basketball who just had a heart attack, who was just starting the ministry and everything was going great, and he had no clue as to why that happened. And just the idea that someone would go, I don't know why God allows certain things because he's a sovereign God, but I know he's loving and I know what he went through, unlocked a lot of, like, well, I don't have to know all of these things, but I have a model here of a kind of character that's helpful.
So...
But then later on, I started learning the theology a little bit better.
So there's another aspect of this that I find dangerous, and I'm not trying to harp on anybody who holds this perspective.
I'd love to have a conversation with you, because I do feel like people don't hold on to these positions because they want to hurt people. In fact, oftentimes they don't tell the person directly, you don't have enough faith. Sometimes they do, and I've heard it. What they say is, you need to have more faith. And it's almost like you're being coached into positivity and to just kind of believe in it and not to think negative at all. And so if you went to them and go, no, we're not going to talk negative, we're just going to talk positive. And so you kind of go like, well, I can't say I'm hurting sometimes. That's kind of where it goes.
Yeah, I mean, there's a host of questions from, like, is it only ailments that are going to kill you? Or is it like baldness?
What about death?
Well, baldness, like, just cut my hair off because I got bald spots. Like, if I had more faith, I could ask Jesus to grow my hair back. I mean, what level does this end?
Yeah.
What is the key level of faith? How do we measure faith?
Those questions are going to get you in trouble.
This kind of stuff, right? So, I mean, this is the stuff that I would always be a snarky, mean kid about.
Welcome to me. I was that kid.
Well, it's a snarky, mean college student.
Well, I was a young kid, and just, I wasn't trying to be mean. I was really legitimately, at first, really kind of like, this is important to me, and got a lot of push down, but not.
Yeah, because then there's the other part. This is the part that I find dangerous. If there's a faithometer, at what level of your faith do you have to have before you know you're saved? Does that play in these circles? Like, you just, like, so now you're going like, if I don't have enough faith to be healed, do I have enough faith to be saved? Because I know people who struggled with, am I saved? Do I have enough faith? Almost like they're supposed to have faith in their faith.
Well, this is why some people, I don't see that as, I mean, it is a problem, and it's not just a problem in that particular type of theology. It's a problem in many churches with people who struggle with what I consider to be like esteem issues, almost like you just feel like God couldn't save me. I need to be a better person. And so they yo-yo. What'll happen is they'll backslide for a while, then come back and be super holy, and then backslide, and then come super holy. And
that's called an addict.
Yeah. Well, and I like, look, you're not good enough out there or in here.
Either way, you're in the same position.
Way, so stay here when you go through your dark periods, because I think that's where you can be ministered to the most. You keep thinking that you have to have this faith that you don't have, and you can't be here with us at the church if you don't exercise it a certain way. So it does become salvific. It doesn't get this heady. It just emotionally, what it's like is the person just goes, I'm not good enough for the Lord, and they go off and sin, and then something pushes them back to church, and then they go to the altar, they feel like God cleanses them again, and they kind of start the cycle. And then they kind of go drift a little bit, and until you get the word in you, the proper understanding of what your condition is before the Lord, you will kind of yo-yo for a while until you figure it out. Most people, though, in that particular, even my growing up, isn't their struggle, but it is a lot of people's struggle to a certain degree.
So I want to just, for those of you who may have that struggle, I want to affirm that there is one thing that I believe theologically taught, is that if there is no one in heaven that didn't want to be there, and there will be no one in hell that wanted to be truly in heaven. What I mean by that is, like, you're not going to go into hell and find a group of people who go like, oh man, I really wanted to be with that God, and he didn't let me in. That's not how God works. If you really want to be with God, if you really want to be saved through the work of Jesus Christ, I believe God sees that as the mustard seed faith, and you're saved. There's not a level of faith you got to get to. There's not some kind of standard deviation of faith that you have to hit. The Jesus-o-meter doesn't have to go off. You long to be with God, to know him, and you long to be after him, and you ask him to save you through Jesus. I think everybody in heaven will be there that longs for that. And I think that time will tell that out, but ultimately I don't think there will be anyone in hell who is going to sit there and go like, I really, really wanted that God and be in heaven through Jesus. No. They'll have other reasons they think they should be in heaven.
The other thing is, if you keep running from the one who knew you were a sinner in the first place, is it because you think you're not good enough? And the answer is yes, you're not. And he still loves you anyway. And so you keep running from him even when he loves you. And the farther you run, the more you're out there, the more harm you're going to do to yourself. I say fail in his presence. Like, literally confess. Like, I have this flaw, and keep confessing and asking God to remove the sin from your life, but never act like it doesn't exist or I need to hide or run from it. And so what I've learned is that the whole point of me not having the ability to save myself is that I do need a savior to cry out to help me with my sins when I fall short.
Yeah, if there's one thing I think I want everybody to understand is that faith is not a magic wish fulfillment like many naturalists think we believe. I see why they think so with certain theologies out there. But it is not magic wish fulfillment. It is legitimately the trust in the promise that God has given with his evidences, but you're trusting the person and his response to your trust. And I think that, again, we got to get back to that. It's an allegiance.
Yeah.
It's a trust. I mean, it's not just a mental belief assent, and it's not magic faith throwing myself off. Those are destructive and not Christian.
Yeah. I mean, claiming God's promises apart from understanding what they mean is also kind of concerning to me. Like, every promise that you hold to is in a context, in a text, in a particular reason for a meaning. And you can, if you pull them out of context, you can almost make any miracle almost like an incantation. If I say these verses over and over again in my head, pray them over and over again, that's going to help me believe them. You know what I mean? And it's like, well, okay, you can say to God, I believe that this is true, but I'm struggling with obedience. Or I believe this is true, but I doubt this, and I'm struggling holding on to this other sin. Or that's an honest conversation. To pretend like you don't have those doubts is to actually not believe that God is able to hear them. Like somehow that if I proclaim these, I'm going to lose my relationship with Jesus. If you think about it in terms of a human being, if I wanted to ask a powerful king who loved me, was my father, something, and I was like, but I'm going to hide everything about me because I don't want to ask him without him knowing all the facts, it's not helpful. Like, if the person is your father, he's going to want to know the good and the bad to give you the advice that you need to strengthen the relational aspect and to build the trust. If you're like, well, I can't show him my doubts, I can't share them, I don't have enough faith to doubt in front of my Lord. He can't. That would take us away from each other. I don't see God that way. I see God as capable of hearing your doubts and going, I understand who you are.
Yeah, and I think what I want to do is also help people change the language a little bit. If you do that, is to say, hey, God, I want this thing, but I fear that you won't, that you're not going to.
Yeah.
And that's really more honest. God already knows your fears. Doubt actually is, I believe, the belief that God can't do something. It's like, I doubt it. That's a more of a snarky kind of comment. Most oftentimes, fear is a better term for that. At least I've thought through it that way. I think let's close the door on that real quick.
Yeah, that's fine.
And I want to kind of move forward in the text because there's another interesting piece here that led to a different conversation that we've had over the last couple of weeks. And for a lot of you, a lot of people don't realize that there are textual variants in their Bibles. That what you have here is a translation of Greek that takes into account, scholars sit down and they know that there's other readings out there. And there's one of those in here, for example, and it's a really interesting one. It would read this way, and a leper came to him, imploring him, and kneeling said to him, if you will, you can make me clean. And the verse 41 says, moved with pity. Now, I believe I'm going to read a few versions here.
Yeah, if you have different versions, you'll notice this right away.
The Lexham English Bible actually puts it this way. And this is, I got to zip back to it. Mark chapter 1, so verse 40.
40 and 41 is where we're at.
It says, if you are willing, you are able to make me clean. And becoming angry, he stretched out his hand and touched him. The New English Translation, the Net Bible, if you are willing to make me clean. Moved with indignation. The NIV, it puts it this way. A man with lepers begged him on his knees, if you're willing, you make me clean. Jesus was indignant. I believe it's the NASB says, moved with compassion. The NLT, moved with compassion. Wait, what is going on here?
The NIV says Jesus was indignant, right?
Yeah, the NIV is indignant. You got, so is it indignant?
Is it pity?
Pity?
Indignation?
Indignation? Is it compassion? Why is it one seems positive, one seems negative? Stephen, thoughts?
Moved with compassion. Well, this is more of a Greek contextual question, really, for you.
It is. I'll just, for anybody who wants to geek out on it, the reading found in almost the entire New Testament manuscripts. I'm reading from the translation notes in the Net Bible, second edition.
So you'll see this if you have a study Bible. At the bottom, you'll see a lot of good study Bibles will put this particular textual concern in the text.
In it, and that's why I'm bringing it up.
Yeah, it might not be in your study Bible, but it's in some.
This one says the reading found in almost the entire New Testament manuscripts tradition is this word splunknistis, which is moved with compassion.
Splunking?
Yeah, it's literally moved in your gut.
Okay.
So
his guts moved.
His guts were moving, and so Codex Beza 1358, and a few Latin manuscripts read orgestes, which is just moved with anger. And so it's different. And so the problem is when we try to measure these things out,
it's a different word in English.
Is it orgestes, or is it this splangantes, this other one? Compassion shows up in every other time this story is told. In all the other Gospels. And Mark is typically considered the root of the other Gospels.
Yeah, it's like the first one. A lot of people think it's the first Gospel.
In certain contexts.
Yeah.
But then the difficulty is when you get something like this, Jesus is mad? Why would that change? And so scholars have to sit down and look at internally, it looks like it should be compassion. But what would be the reasoning to change it is the confusing part. Why would you want to say that Jesus is angry? What's going on? There's no reason that this moved with anger should be there. Now, some say it should be prompted by verse 43, where he looks around, 143 is prompted by another spot earlier, where he looks around, he's angry because he's like, which would you rather have, them do good or evil on the Sabbath? And angrily, becoming angry. He
was moved in his gut.
That's compassion. Compassion is you're moved in your gut.
Okay.
It's not empathy. It's a longing,
stirred in that direction.
I'm stirred for you. It's a deep. You're making me just hurt here. Well, the funny thing is, anger is typically heat in the nose, right?
Long nosed,
other stuff.
Short nosed.
And so, which one is it? And the answer is probably compassion. But this brought up the question, notice that later he says after he heals him, he gives him a very strong warning.
Yeah.
So many feel no, it's probably anger. It's the only time.
This is kind of where I was looking at
in this pericope, when this is told that it says that he was stern with this guy.
Yeah. Don't do this. Don't go. Yeah.
Don't you dare go tell everybody what I just did. Get to the temple and do what you're supposed to do. And so this is one of those interesting ones.
It's kind of angry. It's kind of stern. It's
indignation. Is he? And so people go, is he mad at the leprosy because of what is done to the man? Is he mad at the fallenness of humanity? Because that's often what leprosy represented. Is he mad at the guy for getting too close to him?
Could be that, or the fact that the guy was if you're willing to heal me, What do you mean or if you're able to heal me?
Yeah,
heal
we
me.
don't know what the attitude was.
Was it a snarky attitude in the way he delivered it?
I know you can heal me, but are you willing?
Yeah, are you even gonna? Yeah.
Are you going to do anything about this?
Yeah.
Is he kind of that victim? You meet people who have
with a chip on his shoulder,
chip on their shoulder kind of attitude,
touching him, and he knows that he's making him unclean.
Which reminds me more of the story in the book of John, where he goes to heal the man at the pool.
Yeah,
and the guy's like, "Oh, come on, everybody climbs in ahead of me anyway. It's not going to work." And he's like bitter and like, nah, 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 nah.
Yeah.
And then he ends up turning Jesus in. It's interesting that this leper, it seems like he has a bad attitude.
He's not very obedient.
And then suddenly now all these difficulties start showing because he's running around telling everybody, "Hey, look, he healed me. He healed me."
Yeah, well, when I read this,
I don't know. It's weird.
When I read this text, what struck me, whatever read you take, is the guy's attitude more about what you see Jesus, you hear he's a Messiah, or you hear he claims to heal people, and you're like, well, if you want to heal me, fine. And he's like, well, what do you mean if I want to or if I can? I can do that. And he heals them.
I am willing.
And he's like, oh my gosh, you did it. And then he's like, no, don't tell anybody because you had this attitude and I still healed you. And I so he is compassionate even in his sternness. Like, I'm healing you. Now I need you to do something because I'm giving you some instructions because I want to continue to minister. And he doesn't listen to that. He just goes around talking about his physical well-being. I've been physically well. And he doesn't listen to the person of Jesus, but talks about what Jesus did.
So this leads to the question that we ran into, that you and I both made observation, that our culture has a really hard time believing God gets angry, that Jesus gets angry.
Or that you should be angry as a Christian.
Or that, we should be angry in certain times. And here's a passage where Jesus is potentially angry. We know he will get angry later when he sees indifference to good and evil. I mean, which is really fascinating because that'll hit my Thailand trip when we hit that, because that is really the Buddhist model of the third way of being indifferent about good or evil. You're just kind of existing.
You allow injustice to occur in front of you because you're indifferent to it.
Right, because I'm not going to do it. It's just what happened. That's the karma.
It's just part of the
life.
In
this case, Jesus is like, excuse me?
Yeah.
Now he's angry, And that's a holy anger. That's an appropriate anger.
And that was the thing is a lot of Christians feel like you should never be angry. And oftentimes I've even heard children be instructed never to be angry. The question is, Jesus usually asks is, why are you angry? And I think that even it's like there's passages in Corinthians that's like, be angry, but do not sin in your anger.
Yeah.
Is it Ephesians? Yeah.
Ephesians.
Do not sin in your anger, or do not let the sun go down in your anger, lest you give the devil a foothold, right? So the idea is unevaluated emotional responses without thought and feeling and thought.
And reconciliation appropriately.
To Jesus or what he would want you to do is going to the devil's going to come in and fill in those gaps for you. And so it's not the anger, it's is this the kind of anger I should express? So when people say, well, you should never be angry when someone cuts you off, you should just be compassionate. I'm like, no. The difference is I should have an emotional response to someone who violates a law in front of me. That you just cut everybody off. You're insensitive. The question is, what fruit am I going to do if I respond and yell out my window? Is that going to bring him to the likelihood of following the traffic laws? Is my response going to get me more killed and everyone around me? Am I just contributing to the problem? So it's thinking through well, that's still wrong. I would never say just cutting in front of somebody is ever a good thing. But to be indifferent to it would be well, I should never be angry about someone doing something foolish. Like if you're cutting in and out of traffic, I'm going to look at that as foolish. And it's going to stir my emotions. I'm just not going to respond like an angry beast because that's not going to be fruitful. But it doesn't mean those emotions aren't fueled. There are times when you need to be, if you're a cop and someone cuts in front of you and you're indifferent to it, I would find that to be wrong. It's your job to care about those things. And it is good to care about them. It's just, you may not be the one to answer all of those things. So that's why I do feel a lot of times Christians will allow an evil to occur even in a church or a belief system, not because they think it's right, but because they think there's a greater virtue to never being angry and never confronting anybody. And these are confrontation passages. And so the whole idea is, when is it an appropriate confrontation and how do we do that? And that's really the thing I think we struggle with, because Christians go in the opposite direction. Well, I know this is evil, and I know it is, and you almost forget that you're capable of doing that evil. You're capable of being a sinner. So you do it with a certain sense of mercy. So in the same way you measure other people doing things, you need to remember you need to measure yourself too by God's standard and judge appropriately like he would have you judge.
Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't be careful about our anger, right? I mean, that's what
I'm saying. I'm saying yeah, you should always evaluate your anger.
Be careful that you don't sin in your anger, but be careful that you don't sin by not being appropriately angry.
Yeah. And if you see someone being abused or neglecting, like they're having this problem in the gyms, right? The whole TikTok phenomenon was girls in gyms trying to catch guys staring at them while they're doing their TikTok videos in a gym. And they're like, what you staring at? And he's like, I wasn't doing anything. So guys are getting to the point where if girls are lifting too much weights and there's a girl that had the weight falling on her and the guy just walks right past her. Hey, I'm not going to do anything. You don't want to be rescued. So she's like, ugh. She almost hurts herself. And it's like guys are becoming indifferent to someone being harmed because of the response that they've been given.
And then I even there's the one where the guy's blind.
Yeah.
And the girl's going off on him and gets the manager and he's like, I can't look at you. I'm blind. And she's still yelling at him. I'm just like, oh my gosh.
So there's an appropriate response to someone's indignant behavior that brings about a truth. You should be upset, at certain things. There's appropriateness to it, but there is a greater good that you need to think about, and you need to do something with those emotions. I think most people think it's better to have no emotion. You're going to have them anyway, and to deny them, you're going to actually hurt yourself.
I believe that the Christian life is not an emotionless life. Yeah. It is actually an emotionally appropriate life in which our emotions are rightly dictated and controlled by reality, that there is a true map of reality that, if you have a teenager, this is how it works, right? So your teenager son or daughter is like, and they just get mad about something, and you're just like, look, you're mad about something that's not real. Like right. that emotion is real. Your emotion of anger is true, is real. You feel that. But what you feel it about isn't real. You have now responded to something that doesn't exist. There are times where I'm having a conversation with a friend, or with Teresa, for example, and she says something and I hear it as an accusation, and she doesn't mean it as an accusation at all, and my emotions shift because I'm going with an interpretation, a misinterpretation of reality. And so when I have control of my emotions, evaluate my emotions, and I have a right sense on reality, we Christians should have the best sense of reality, and therefore the best sense of the appropriate emotions that go with that reality. It's an emotional maturity.
Yeah, and it's not immediate. It's something you have to practice. Like most people think, well, I evaluated it. Now I'm doing it right. No, I evaluated it and I still messed that up. I
evaluate it all the time. Yeah, it's practicing. It's actually living it out.
Living it out frequently to where it becomes your base response. Your response emotionally is the mature one. And that's never going to happen all the time, and you're never going to have it 100% right. But the goal is to grow in Christ, and that's going to bring out all the immaturities. And that's what's hard is, again, it's like if you hide your immaturities from the Lord, you don't get better. Wrestling with God is the way to get closer to Him.
And I think this is also a reason why you don't want to push your friend's emotions down. You don't want to turn it into like, well, you're no. I've met people who will deny your emotion. Like, it's okay, you're good, you're not. Or they'll rebuke your emotion, like, that's not the right way to, And yes, there's a coaching. It's difficult to work. We're emotional beings sometimes before we even thoughtful beings. And some of you need to be more emotional because
the opposite is true.
Feel your feelings.
The opposite is true, and that's what you struggle with if you do kind of have the background that I have is you usually be calm in dangerous situations because it's how to get through them. But the problem is when you should be emotionally happy or have a positive one, you don't feel that, and you're not mimicking the good response because it's not natural to you. And so you have to actually practice joy. You have to actually raise your hands and then open your eyes real big. It's better when you do this with children because they bring it out really easily.
They say to do it in a mirror with yourself can actually be extremely helpful because of the mirror neurons that are in you. And it sounds silly, but sometimes before sermons, when I'm feeling down, it's like I have to look at myself in the mirror and smile and come on, because I don't want to look like angry face. And now that I'm bald, I look even mean angry face, meanie. who is this man? These men sitting here being very mad all time. You come from Russia, does he not? He's like extremely angry. Anyway, so that's like kind of the internal Russians now coming out. But
talk to your internal Russian.
Like this kind of leads into a conversation though, and we're gonna close Mark up, and you guys gave us some really good questions. We've got 3 of them, and we want to try to hit those. And let's just go with the first one, not the first question on our list, but that one that was really talking about the mental health kind of thing, because I think that fits in with this conversation about our appropriate emotions at the appropriate time. Before we hit that question though, you notice we skipped over the one section about the guys being lowering the paralytic down. If you want, check out podcast number 103, whatever one you want to call it. But we actually talk about that in depth from a question from a listener. At the end of the podcast, you'll find it. It was a really good conversation, so you can check that out there. In the meantime, why don't we slip into those questions? What is that question?
Should I read the name or?
No, don't read the name. Just you can go ahead and just.
So someone sent in a question. I'm just going to read it verbatim, and then we can answer the question there. It says, "Dear Rabbit Trail at OBCC, what is your view on mental illness? Can a person with mental illness still be a Christian? For example, if they have a bipolar disorder, can they be saved and have salvation? So thank you for your time, and God bless you." So thank you for your question.
Yeah. And this is a good question for you because you've got the psych background. I mean, we both agree on this one, obviously.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I'll just do the pastoral thing. The answer is yes, you can be a Christian.
Geez, I hope so, Lord.
And yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've got ADHD. Does that count as a mental illness? Some people would say yes.
It's in the diagnostic manual.
So I mean, like bipolar is a pretty dramatic.
It's a severe mental disorder.
So speak to what might be the struggle, or even, I know that you wondered even a question.
Yeah, no, I kind of go back to when I first started studying psychology. I mean, I was going away to take my bachelor's degree in psychology. I left the church, and someone sent me a video, and it was like how psychology is of the devil. And it was a whole videotape on how that is just all secular humanism, and it's just all gobbledygook.
Well, let's be honest, much of Freud.
Yes,
and a lot of
which I found out from studying it,
and a lot of it is secular humanist underpinnings. They try to take evolutionary thinking and apply it, but there are aspects of it that are general revelation that are good for all humanity, observable scientifically, and things like this.
So what happened was, in the church, because of Freud starting psychology as mostly just more like a philosophy of science for him. He didn't have research. He didn't do experiments in the way that we do experiments now.
He did experiments. They were just...
Yeah, he was mostly based on his anecdotal observations. He just saw things and then said, well, this is why they happen.
Yeah, I listened to some guy today who said, if you talk to all psychologists, they'll tell you everything Freud said was wrong.
Wrong.
With the exception of that probably the thing that you resist the most is the thing that's going to own your life the most. And I was like, this problem.
Yeah, and so Freud started the conversations, but there are Freudian psychologists, but I mean, currently there aren't very many practicing. Analytical psychology is something uber wealthy people do. And it's not favored in the science community. But early on, the church kind of combated these philosophies, and I understand from the history of Freud and just the damage that he's done.
And Jung and...
Yeah, well, Jung and them, there's a little more research there, but yes. But what happened is it's the arts that developed and took hold of those philosophies and put them in movies. So a lot of what people think of as psychology is actually not what people practice when they go see a therapist. Psychology is much like any other discipline in the sense that it has a worldview formation based on whatever aspect of it you grasp. So if you go to a holistic doctor, they're going to have a philosophy of how people get well. If you go to a podiatrist or someone who's a neurologist, they're going to think most things are neurological more than they are something else. So you start having these
then there
bents.
are different kinds of, there's logotherapists, and there are who want to use words and talking.
But so
there are those who are Christian therapists that are like, no, we're going to use the word of God, and this is, so there's different forms of counseling all under the garb.
There's self-help books that have nothing to do with psychology. So just know that that's part of the debate between Christians and psychology, right? There's this kind of historic debate.
But let's take a step further, because there's psychology, And there is a debate there. But even more heated is actually psychiatry, in which now we're talking about mind-altering drugs,
the psychopharmacologies,
pharmacology, those kinds of things. And the way that I'm just going to state it, the way that I understand it, is that I don't believe that these things are outside of the realm for Christians. I think we should be careful.
Sure.
That we should just don't go take the latest designer drug because it's the latest designer drug. However, there is a reality that when our brain is not us. Like, this is where Christians need to be careful. What are you smuggling into your faith? You are a soul. Your brain is one of the organs of your body. In fact, I love how John Mark Comer said it in a podcast I listened to today. He said that one of the big dangers that we've assumed in our culture is that, as Thomas Edison said, the whole body is designed to carry around the brain. It's like we're brains.
It was a very modern way of thinking.
And that's just not the case. You are a holistic being, body, soul, and mind.
This is a debate in psychology. I mean, it's usually the debate between the hard science people and the people who counsel people.
The people who call them souls.
Yeah, but because when you talk to people enough, you start to realize they talk as if they have one. And all throughout history, that's always been the case. Up until now, they say, no, it's really just you think you have one. It's an illusion. And people really wrestle with that being the fact that historically we've always thought. And
guess what? My illusion thinks I have an illusion.
Yeah. And not everybody thinks that way. But getting back to the idea of psychology, psychology is, when it's best used by the church, is used with what I consider to be a medical model of in part, because even the medical model has a problem, in the fact that we have a body and it does respond to certain physiological responses. There are certain mental conditions, because you mentioned bipolar, that are typically scientifically analyzed as problem areas of the brain that you can actually map out and see. So there are these conditions in psychology that work best with some medication and always counseling.
And community.
And community, yes. And these are called abnormal psychological conditions. They're not called every day I get depressed because I got through divorce issues, or I'm going through sadness.
Abnormal, again, does not mean
that you're a bad person. Or anything.
It just means outside of the norm.
The normal curve of if you
statistics.
Took a couple thousand people, there might be one or two individuals that have a problem that no one else has.
We used to call that special.
Yeah, we used to Well, we used to say, the extra grace, or there's something interesting, but we're finding that a lot of those issues typically have medical conditions attached to them, especially bipolar. People do well on medication. They do better with medication counseling and the church, if you really want to know. I mean, with the community is what I'm saying.
Well, and community, primarily
healthy community.
The truth of the church, the truth of scriptures.
Yeah.
And this is what is interesting, because in the past, people have had these conditions, and they were managed in the church together, as you would pull the community around these people, loving on them, caring about them.
You would guide
especially
them.
In the Protestant church in the early 17, 16, all those time periods. They actually you would go to see the pastor as a spiritual doctor.
Sure.
And he would prescribe, literally they would call it this way, prescribe to you passages to memorize, meditate on, to pray through. And it was because what we discover now is like, they actually have a name for this in psychology, right? It's called
cognitive behavioral therapy.
What does it do?
So cognition is how you think, the processes of thoughts, and behavior is what you do. And you need to have a correlation between that and reality. And so sometimes what you think often mimics or doesn't mimic what you do.
Just what we talked about with emotions.
Yeah, what you do doesn't always mimic what you say you think, right? And so the idea is you sit there and ask, is that true? So if someone's saying, I just hate myself, no one loves me, everything is awful, you ask, well, that's an absolute statement. Is that true? And so you would say, does that correspond to reality? And so what you're saying in the medical model and with the cognitive behavioral model is that there is a reality, and it's not whatever you feel or think. It's typically something you can analyze. So if you have a condition like bipolar, it's analyzed quite well because it's a severe condition. And there are appropriate responses that science and the communities have developed that seems to be more fruitful than not when they're intervened. It's called best practices. So you apply those best practices. And if you're a Christian, even better, because we do believe in a soul, is in order to align yourself with reality, there's nothing, in my opinion, more realistic than the belief system that Scripture offers about the state of humanity.
So, and this is important. and I want to state this because this is why yes, someone can be saved. We have one of our favorite apologists.
Oh yeah,
literally
David Wood.
David Wood is literally a psychopath.
Yeah, he was in prison and everything,
and yet he loves Jesus.
Yes.
Now, the brain can actually, it's beautiful. They can rewire. There's a plasticity to it, a neuroplasticity. You can build wirings,
with habits.
New wirings with new habits and new. Guess what we called those? We called those the spiritual disciplines.
Yeah.
And the church got so fixated on the theology, the right thinking processes, we forgot that there's a behavior to every right thought.
Thought, feeling, and a biology.
Right. And so if you are a Christian, you need to return to the practices, the thinking, and the right emotional state in the scriptures. And you need to be cognizant of it. And there are better practices for some than others. Like, man, if you're in one of those kind of manic
bell curve,
manic depressive states or something, if you're journaling and you're doing things that you're starting to know, you're doing self-analysis, you're praying and you're asking God to reveal things, and you keep accountability where people are saying, hey, I see that you're going into this, and you're willing to be humble. These are powerful agents to help you know how to work it through as you give your brain neuroplasticity, which is what the drugs often do. They often help.
They put you back to a place where you can develop a new pattern.
Right.
So you still need the therapy because you when you act out of your illness, it creates habits in you that you now have to fix when you're well. And that's true of something like bipolar because you have ups and downs, and then you have periods of time where there's rational belief systems going on. I think what people struggle with, and I think a lot of people confuse bipolar with something like schizophrenia, but bipolar can do this as well if it's very extreme, is you don't grasp reality. There's a problem in your biology that doesn't help you see the truth. So can the Spirit of God
break through
that? And I say, in witnessing to people who suffer from schizophrenia or having faith conversations, I would say it would be better if you were someone that talked to someone who had expertise in both fields, because you can add to the problem. But know that I do believe that there are moments of sobriety, moments of clarity that the gospel can get through, and those are the times in which you work with that person to see them through. And it's through a lot of prayer, and you have to have a lot of grace, because you're thinking they have to grasp the reality of the truth of this, and if they're not capable of it at the time you're talking to them, then it's not going to be fruitful at that time.
And I think what we need to remember is God, who is not just all powerful, he's all knowing.
Yeah.
He will judge us according to the standard by which we are capable of making a volitional belief. And I think that he's gracious, he's merciful. That's not to say that every single person you tell the gospel to, and he knows how to bring the message. If the Spirit of God wants to reach someone through their schizophrenia, their bipolar, whatever it is, he will. And I do actually believe that he will. Like, this is the question often that comes up. Hey, what happens to somebody who gets in a car accident, has a head injury, and now they're swearing against God and all these kinds of things? Are they no longer saved? And these things have happened.
Sure.
And we believe that God judges a person when they were in their right mind, not in their most broken. And so, because oftentimes there is the person who believes that's sitting in the background, and he can't get the brain to fire in the direction they want. And so
it is a complicated issue, and I think people want a simple answer. But I will say that, in psychology, there's a huge variability of issues. Like if you're suffering from depression, I'm going to say that's both a biological, psychological, social,
and spiritual,
and a deep spiritual understanding of hope and difficulties that's going to require all of those fields. You're going to need to talk to a pastor and a counselor and a therapist and someone who understands medication that doesn't just give you drugs to fix a problem.
Drugs won't fix it.
But sees you holistically as a person, not just as a drug machine that you just give a pill and then the response comes out the other end.
You're not a computer.
Yeah, and that's my fear with the medical model. Where it goes wrong is it just thinks of you as a machine. You aren't not a machine, but you're way more than a machine. So I don't think that that's going to fix the problem, and I think science kind of proves that true. Hopefully, I don't know if that answers the question. I
think it does.
I think for me, just what I consider to be something is my goal is to be loving and kind and truthful, but know that it can't always be the truth that you deliver can't always be impacted.
The only final piece here that I want to clarify is that you asked about mental illness. Now, there are cases of demonic demonization that can mimic a mental illness.
Sure.
And there is a way to go through a process of evaluation for those things. At Talbot, we were trained that first you go through a medical and psychological evaluation before you ever assume as demonic, and that there's a lot of history and things you have to look through there. In the case of someone who's manifesting demonic situations, that is a whole other question and a whole other rabbit trail that we don't have time to dive down. But we do not believe that all mental illness is a manifestation of demonic. And I just want to make that clear.
Yeah, well, that'd be great to make clear, because we talked about that earlier.
Right.
That's how I got into psychology. But I would say that just for the best practices of psychology is getting a therapist who does understand both that you are a whole person, that you're spiritually a person, psychologically, socially, and uses practices that are capable of being grounded. They have outcomes. If someone's applying a method to you about suffering depression that seems counterintuitive, bring it up. If they're saying, oh, don't read your scriptures or don't pray, or if you go to a counselor who just quite honestly just never prays with you, I'm always a little leery, because there are a lot of Christian counselors that will do that. You'll sit there and go, we didn't pray.
Right.
And so that kind of concerns me. You're supposed to integrate both the best practices with your spiritual understanding of the word.
Well, we hope that helped answer some of your questions. If you got a follow-up question, let us know. But I'm going to jump into Brian's question that he gave us here.
Is it Brian? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Thanks, Brian, for the question. He said, my question is, did Jesus lie to his brothers about not going to the feast? And so it comes from John 7, 3 through 4, where it has Jesus' brothers telling him to go to the Feast of Booths in John 7, 8. Jesus replied, go up to the feast yourselves. I do not go up to this feast because my time has not yet fully come. However, in verse 10, Jesus does go to the feast. He then preaches in public while there. What gives? How can Jesus tell his brothers that he's not going to the feast? Then right after they leave, he goes. Couldn't Jesus have just said that he would go up later to the feast? Is there something in the English translations that is lost? Appreciate the answers. Any answers you can provide. Merci beaucoup. Pardon my French. Right. So, interesting passage. Back when we covered this in the book of John a few years ago, this was one of those that I found fascinating, and most scholars that as they kind of worked through, most commentators that I was reading really just kind of said there was two parts to this. On one side was the intention of the brothers. The brothers don't believe in Jesus. In some way, they're kind of mocking him and giving him satanic advice. Yeah. You should picture this as like the same scene of him standing on the Temple Mount, or the temple with the devil going, hey, throw yourself off, make a big scene, and everybody will come to you. It's very similar. The brothers are like, hey, go up there and like show yourself off, and they give this kind of advice of like, you can't do anything in hiding, everybody will know. It's almost like, go be the miracle worker you are, Mr. Brother.
Come out and tell everybody how great you are.
Show everybody you're the Messiah, how amazing you are if you're really the Messiah. And because they don't believe, there's a background of like, hey, you're going to do what we tell you to do kind of attitude. We're part of the family. And Jesus very often resists his own family. He even tells his mother no.
Yeah.
But then mom's like, you're going to do it. And he's like, okay, change the water into wine, kind of thing. So is Jesus lying? Not necessarily. I wouldn't say he's lying. I would say that he is denying their suggestion. Notice he says, go up the feast yourselves, or go by yourself. We don't need to go with you. This is John 7.
Verse 8, you go up to the feast. I'm not going up to this feast, for my time is not yet fully come. After saying this, he remained in Galilee.
Right. And so you go, I'm not going up to this feast because my time has not yet fully arrived. And so the idea is, again, this sounds very blatant. Like, I'm not going to the feast at all. Most are saying that he is basically saying, you go up, I'm not going with you. I'm not going at the same time.
Well, he also remained there for a time.
Yeah, he remained in Galilee because he had to go, or he would have disobeyed the law. This is the Feast of Booths.
Yeah.
And the law says you need to go to Jerusalem for the Feast of Booths. So
it's a public festival, too.
Jesus can't be saying, I'm not going at all, because he would, this would violate the law. And so that it implies then that he's basically saying, I'm not going with you. And so then he does go up, but he goes in his own power, in his own time, and starts to do his own thing. It says he didn't go, and so he says Jesus himself also went up, not openly, but in secret. And so he's not out. In fact, it makes it very clear he's not doing what they said to do, which is, hey, we're not going to do it in secret. For no one who seeks to make a reputation for himself does anything in secret. If you're doing these things, show yourself to the world. That so sounds like Satan, right? Mm-hmm. Same thing. And so then it literally says, after they've left, he remained. But when his brothers had gone to the feast, then Jesus himself also went up, not openly, but in secret. He literally doesn't take their
public
advice. And so this really very clearly represents that this isn't about him lying. This is about him obeying his father and just saying, I'm not going with you guys. I'm not going in that way, and I'm not going up with you guys. So you no.
No. He's like, no, I'm not going to go and be public like you asked me to. Right. So he stays there on purpose. Then they leave and they go, and then he's like, okay, it's time to go to the feast, but I'm not going to let anybody see me. I'm not going to do what they're saying I'm going to do even at the feast.
Exactly.
So yeah.
So that's kind of my answer for that. If that wasn't satisfying, you're like, nope, he lied. Well,
I'd like to know how you think the person lied. That'd be a good question to ask, because I think it's pretty clear in the text.
Yeah. So, but no, that's a good question. I think a lot of people ask that when they get to that passage. And now our final esoteric science question. Are you
going to tackle
of the
this
week.
one?
We're going to tackle this one. This is
okay.
not going to be. It's actually, I don't think it's as long of an answer as we think. But Christian asked this one. He says, "Hey guys, in 1997, fossils attributed to Neanderthals were found to have sequentiable DNA. So they could actually sequence the DNA of Neanderthals.
It shows up on your ancestry.com if you do it.
Well,
2% it says.
So
they
could say anything, like you're going to know. And since then, that same typically, if you have any North American, like European, you're going to have some kind of Neanderthal, I think, show up in some way. Since that time, DNA is found in 2% of humans, indicating our two species coexisted and procreated. And so he kind of goes like, look, this he loves archaeology. He believes it shows the Bible is accurate. And his confession, he says, no problem accepting the science, but sometimes he struggles with accepting some of these things that don't seem to fit in the Bible's narrative. Mm-hmm. And so why do we accept some science and not other science? That's his first question. And I would say that we don't accept all science because science has a rigorous level of
when it's done well,
proof that is necessary. And God's revelation is not going to lie to us. History isn't going to lie to us in the sense of like you dig something up. What lies to us is us. So if I dig up these bones and I find all this stuff around these bones and these, hey, look, the Neanderthals, they made these cave paintings and the Neanderthals. This is really a debate about, are we interpreting this rightly?
The scripture or the science?
The science. And I bring this up because there has been in archaeology a very famous case where in the early 1900s, they started finding these strange things that they called the special idol. And I think I've talked about this, but it had all these pegs in it and this stuff. And then they're like thinking this is some Egyptian idol that they've discovered and it's a Canaanite import and all this stuff. Lo and behold, it shows up in Babylonia and then it shows up in the Hittites. And they're like, what's going on? And it was just a very popular board game. It was the most popular board game.
Is that Ur?
It shows up everywhere. It's all throughout the Middle East, and this is extremely popular board game. Which
I like board games.
They're but they thought they literally categorized it as an idol for decades and decades and decades. Had scholastic papers and doctorates given all over. Yeah. So that being said, sometimes we don't accept science because it's not quote settled. Right? Settled. What is settled science? There's no science that's settled. All science sits within paradigms. And so the paradigm that is held currently has been upended with Neanderthals. I was doing some research on this. Used to believe that Neanderthals were way back here in the human history and they were part of our lineage to bring about modern man. Because of this kind of information, because of these kinds of things, they actually, the paradigm is in shift, massive shift, to the point where they're starting to have to accept that Neanderthals are actually modern humans. They're just another branch of us. They've done brow measurements and all that stuff of Aborigines in Australia, and they match Neanderthals.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And so there's this stuff that comes out, and they're afraid to say it because it looks racist and stuff, but they're getting better. And Gunter Bentley wrote an excellent blog. Gunter Bentley he's I don't even know if he's a Christian, but he helps out with the ID science guys.
Okay.
And he's converted only recently over to this kind of ID theory stuff. He's a German paleo entomologist who specializes in the fossil history and systematics of insects. He did a giant read, and you can find it on evolutionnews.org. And just type in Neanderthals, you'll get all their stuff. But he just basically says, look, with the appearance of their behavior, the things they've discovered, the paintings, the burial sites, they think they've just discovered a Neanderthal that had Down syndrome, and yet and it was an older age. They're like, how the implication is that they cared for this child, in fact, so that they loved it. With all of this, and new anatomic data has shown that they stood upright just like we do, that their vocal larynxes were the same, and they just, at this point, I think the answer is very simple with a Neanderthal is species only propagate with species.
Yeah.
They're the same species, and they were just another branch of humans that were kind of robust and lived away up in the European areas. So that saying, I think sometimes we see that paradigms are shifting when enough information comes in that the old paradigm has to be rejected. This is the ID theory guys are trying to argue that's why we need to throw out incremental evolution, that there are these epics of creative moments that Hugh Ross has been arguing for, and they may not all agree, but there seems to be this new paradigm that as Christians we can hold to, and you've got or you can hold to the creation science, 6-day creation. They would just say that these are some kind of ape men that
are not human,
or they were one of the branches of Noah's or pre-Noahic people. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that they could try to
primates
put that
of a different
together,
kind.
right? So he goes on, accepting human and Neanderthal matings would seem to indicate that maybe it wasn't just Adam and Eve as mentioned in Genesis, or the biblical story of Adam and Eve is the story of one family in a world that had a lot of people. There are some scholars who think that Adam and Eve were just like God created cattle. He didn't just create two cattle, he created all the cattle, right?
Yeah.
So when he created mankind, male and female, he created a whole bunch of them. And then Adam and Eve are the
spiritual representations for all of them.
Yeah, the crown king and queen, the priests of the humanity. The problem with that is that then you wind up with not all humanity being from Adam and Eve. And so who would be our spiritual forefathers? And it would be a multi-generational, we wouldn't be of the same genetic stock. And there's plenty of evidence we all come from one pair somewhere back there, mitochondrially called mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam. And so there is actually, I believe that the better way to read it is just to know that this is a very, very ancient historical memory.
Yeah.
That we're talking 100,000 years old, which is far enough back for many of the for some of the datings in these kinds of things, for the Denisovans and the Neanderthals. And William Lane Craig just wrote a huge old book on this, and it was complicated, interesting, and even he in the end says we don't know, but the best answer is these stories are much more ancient. And what has happened is the memory has gone through and it's been stylized in these mythos of the time period.
Mythic history.
Yeah. So that what's weird is that, yes, guess what? The Aztecs have a plumed serpent god, and he's the good guy. Well, that's weird. And the Incas have that. And guess what? The Native Americans have these.
They have a lot of ziggurat temple literature.
You go into all of these ancient places, and there's this serpent, these dragons. like with Buddha and all the dragons, like all in the Hindu temples.
And they're not corresponding to a physical being. It's usually
they're
considered some kind of spiritual being. Yeah.
And so this goes so far back. I think that Christian theology can handle a very ancient Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
And that we are the ones least surprised when we're digging in. What's that place? Google. What's that?
Which one?
That ancient place keeps blowing away all the dating.
Göbekli Tepe.
Göbekli Tepe, and it's
Turkey.
There's all kinds of stuff. So, when was Cain exiled? He went off. Started. If they did live older and longer, which still is very capable, and Hugh Ross makes some good arguments on that. Then Cain wouldn't be the very.
Could have been a lot of ancestors.
There could have been ancestors and stuff that he could have gone to. So how we read all of that stuff is not necessarily unheard of. He goes off and creates a city. They do live.
You're talking about
long enough to do these things with Cain.
And the land of Nod, east of Eden.
Yeah. So, but are there these other human beings? That is, I know professors at Cal Baptist that believe that. So that is not outside.
They have an argument for how they look at the firstness of Adam and Eve and how we're connected to them.
And there's more to your question, and I want to tackle more of that later, but I just wanted to hit the Neanderthal part first, and then we'll dive into the rest of this other piece. But Christian, thanks, man. It was really insightful, and we'll pick up more next week, because at this point, we're out of time. And so... And it's hot in here. Our air conditioner's not working, so we're kind of ready to move on. But we are glad that you guys joined us this week on this rabbit trail, and we hope that as you guys go along, that you have some more questions and you're interested in some of the details of the book of Mark, as we're going to be moving forward into the next section, and we're going to be talking a lot about this idea of fasting. And new and old and wineskins and stuff. Check out that next section. You may have some questions after the sermon, or maybe you've got some questions that were raised through our other conversations. Whatever they are, let us know. Send us an email at rabbittrail@obcc.church. That's rabbittrail@obcc.church. In fact, if you're looking on the podcast, scroll down to your notes. You'll find that right there. You can click on it and email us right away your question. We're just glad that you joined us. We're glad that you're listening, and we pray that God would bless you guys over your rest of your week. And so I'm going to say it for Brent. Boom shakalaka.
Bye.